The evening lights of the city shimmered like gold dust over the river as guests arrived one after another at the grand hall of the Silverstone Hotel. The place was decorated with tall crystal chandeliers, white roses, and tables covered with shining silk cloths. It was one of those nights where everything looked perfect, the kind of night that belonged to the rich, the powerful, and the well-known faces of the city. The hotel staff moved quietly in the background, making sure every detail matched the grandeur of the occasion. Among them was a young waitress, dressed neatly in her black and white uniform, her hair tied back tightly. She had arrived early, helping the team arrange cutlery, polish glasses, and prepare the serving trays. Her shifts were long, but she rarely complained. Every job she took mattered. Each extra hour meant a bit more money she could send home. She wasn't from a rich family. In fact, her world was far away from the kind of people who would attend such a glittering event.
Yet she carried herself with quiet dignity,
never letting exhaustion or shyness show on her face. As the evening began, she moved between the tables, refilling glasses and offering drinks with a polite smile. She avoided unnecessary conversation, only speaking when spoken to. Most guests hardly noticed her. They were too busy discussing business, showing off jewelry, or taking pictures beside the grand piano that stood beautifully at the center of the room. The piano gleamed under the lights, its polished surface reflecting the glittering crowd. A soft jazz tune played in the background through hidden speakers, giving the hall a relaxed but elegant mood. The event was hosted by a famous businessman, a man known for his wealth and influence. He was tall, confident, and always surrounded by people eager to please him. His name was often in the newspapers, and not always for the right reasons. Some admired his success, while others whispered about his pride. He enjoyed being the center of attention. Wherever he went, the spotlight followed. Tonight was no different. Every guest wanted a word with him. Every camera turned in his direction. The young waitress had seen him in magazines, but never up close. When she first noticed him that evening, he was laughing loudly with a group of guests near the stage. His voice carried across the room, full of authority and self-importance. She quickly looked away and continued her work, hoping to remain invisible for the night. But fate, as it often happens, had different plans. As she placed a tray of glasses near one of the tables, she overheard a conversation between two guests. One of them pointed toward the piano and said, "I wonder why no one's playing tonight. That piano's just sitting there." The other guest smiled and said jokingly, "Maybe one of the staff can play. They probably have hidden talents." They laughed, and the young waitress smiled faintly, remembering something from her past. She had once loved the piano. As a child, she used to play old melodies her mother taught her. But life had changed quickly. After her mother passed away, she had to leave school and work. The piano lessons stopped, and the instrument was sold to pay bills. Years went by, and her hands grew more used to holding trays than pressing keys. Still, whenever she saw a piano, something inside her stirred, a quiet longing that she kept buried deep within. One of the guests noticed her small smile and asked casually, "Do you play?" She hesitated, caught off guard. "I used to," she said softly, "a long time ago." The guest chuckled. "Then maybe you should give us a song." She quickly shook her head. "Oh no, sir. I haven't played in years. I wouldn't even remember how." The man laughed and went back to his drink, but his voice carried just enough for the host to overhear. The businessman turned, curiosity lighting up his eyes.
"What's this?"
he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Our waitress here can play the piano?" The crowd turned to look. The young woman froze, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. She tried to speak, but the words didn't come out. "It's nothing, sir," she managed to say politely. "I used to play when I was a child." "Not anymore." The businessman smiled, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Nonsense," he said. "Once you learn something like that, you never truly forget it. Go ahead, give us a little tune. We could all use some real entertainment tonight." A few people chuckled. Others looked uncomfortable. The woman felt a wave of nervousness rising inside her. Her throat went dry and her cheeks burned. She didn't want to make a scene, but refusing in front of all these people felt impossible. She lowered her eyes and said quietly, "Please, sir, I can't. I'd rather not." The businessman's smile faded slightly. He wasn't used to being refused, especially not by someone serving drinks. "Oh, come on," he said, pretending to sound encouraging. "It's just for fun. No one's judging you." but the tone of his voice carried a hint of challenge and people sensed it. A few laughed again, whispering among themselves. The pianist who had been hired for the night was late, and the idea of watching a nervous waitress stumble through a song amused some of the guests. The young woman's heart pounded. She wanted to disappear, to run into the kitchen and never come back. But she couldn't. Her manager stood nearby, watching the scene with worry, afraid of upsetting the host. "Go ahead," the businessman insisted again. "Show us what you've got." Someone clapped teasingly, and the laughter grew. The young woman took a slow breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. Every instinct told her to say no, but then she saw the expression on the businessman's face. It wasn't friendly. It was the look of someone expecting her to embarrass herself. That look changed everything. For a moment, time seemed to slow. She glanced at the piano shining under the light, and felt a rush of memories flood her mind. Her small hands on the keys, her mother's gentle voice guiding her. The warmth of home, the music that once made her feel alive. She didn't know if she could still play, but she suddenly didn't want to walk away either. She placed her tray on a nearby table and took a step forward. The crowd went silent. The businessman leaned back, crossing his arms, a confident grin on his face. The woman moved slowly toward the piano, her heart thudding in her chest. Every footstep echoed louder than the music. The closer she got, the heavier the silence became. Some guests whispered that it was unfair. Others smiled in anticipation. No one expected her to surprise them. They thought she would press a few wrong notes, laugh nervously, and walk away. That was the entertainment they came for. She stood in front of the piano for a long second, her reflection glowing in its black surface. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. She could almost hear her mother's voice saying, "Don't play to impress them, play because you love it." The businessman called out jokingly, "We're waiting." The guests laughed again, and the sound cut through her thoughts like glass breaking. She swallowed hard and closed her eyes for a brief moment. Then, in that quiet pause before anything happened, something changed in her. The fear turned into calm. The noise faded. The laughter no longer mattered. She sat down, straightened her back, and let her hands rest gently on the keys. The room grew still. The guests leaned closer, expecting a clumsy start, maybe a broken melody. But instead, they heard nothing yet, just silence. She took a deep breath, and with that, the first note was about to come. Her fingers rested gently on the piano keys as the crowd waited. The light from the chandeliers reflected softly on her face, showing the mix of fear and quiet strength in her eyes. For a few seconds, no sound came out. Only the clinking of a few glasses broke the silence. The businessman folded his arms, still smiling, expecting her to make a fool of herself. Then slowly she pressed the first key. The note was soft, trembling, almost like a whisper. A few people chuckled, thinking she really didn't know how to play. But as her hands began to move again, something changed. The next few notes came smoother, one flowing into another, and suddenly the sound began to fill the room. The laughter faded. The conversation stopped. Her fingers, though unsure at first, started finding their rhythm. The music that came out was gentle, warm, and full of emotion. It was the kind of melody that didn't need words to speak. Each note carried a feeling, hope, sadness, love, and loss all mixed together. It was as if she was pouring her whole life into that piano. The guests stood frozen. No one expected such beauty from a simple waitress who had been serving drinks just moments ago. Even the businessman's grin slowly disappeared. His eyes narrowed, not out of anger but confusion. It was clear he had underestimated her. As she played, memories began to rise in her mind. Her mother sitting beside her, their small home filled with music instead of noise from the streets. She could almost feel her mother's hand guiding hers again. The pain of losing those days turned into strength in her fingers. The melody grew deeper, more powerful. A few guests looked at each other in disbelief. Some held their drinks midair, too lost in the music to move. One woman near the front quietly wiped her eyes. The sound was unlike anything the hall had heard that night. It wasn't practiced or perfect, but it was real. It came from somewhere pure. The piano's sound spread through the hall, bouncing softly off the marble walls and ceilings. Even the hotel staff had stopped what they were doing. The other waiters stood near the entrance, watching silently. The chef peeked through the kitchen door. The music had reached every corner of the room. Minutes passed, but no one noticed the time. She wasn't reading notes or following a pattern. She was simply letting her heart lead the melody. There was sadness in the tune, but also a quiet kind of hope that made people feel both calm and emotional at once. As the song reached its middle, her confidence grew. Her hands moved faster and her expression softened. The nervousness that once held her down melted away. She looked peaceful, as if for the first time in years she felt truly alive. The businessman stood still, his hands resting on the table. He didn't know how to react. At first he had thought of this as a small joke, something to amuse the guests, but now he realized he had started something far bigger than he imagined. The people who had been laughing moments ago were now completely silent, their eyes fixed on her. The mood of the entire evening had changed because of her. The song began to rise toward its climax. Her fingers danced across the keys with grace and power. The sound was no longer soft. It filled the air with something almost magical, the kind of music that reaches deep into people's hearts, even when they don't understand why. The melody spoke of struggle and dignity, of pain that turns into beauty. Some guests leaned closer to the piano, unable to look away. The light caught her face, showing a mix of calm and fire, strength and grace. She wasn't the shy waitress anymore. She looked like she belonged there, like the stage and the piano were made for her. Even the businessman, for all his pride, couldn't hide the look of surprise on his face. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that the crowd's attention had moved away from him completely. All eyes were now on her. He felt small, almost invisible. The last part of her song slowed down. Her hands moved gently as if saying goodbye to each note. The room was so quiet that even the smallest sound, the click of a glass or a whisper, could be heard. But no one dared to interrupt. The melody faded slowly, the final notes falling like raindrops. And then there was silence. She sat still for a moment, her fingers resting where they had begun. Her chest rose and fell as she caught her breath. She didn't look up right away. She wasn't sure what she had just done or how people would react. For a second, she feared they might laugh again. But instead, a single clap broke the silence. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause. People stood from their seats, cheering and clapping louder than they had all evening. Some whistled, others shouted words of praise. The sound filled the room even more powerfully than the piano had. The young woman looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had expected humiliation, but instead she saw admiration in every face. Guests were smiling at her, nodding in respect. Some even wiped their eyes. The people she had served drinks to all night were now looking at her like she was someone important. The businessman forced a smile and clapped along with the crowd, though he looked uncomfortable. His plan to embarrass her had failed in the most unexpected way. What was supposed to be a joke had turned into the most beautiful moment of the night, and he wasn't the hero of it. She was. The applause went on for a long time. When it finally faded, the host tried to speak, but his voice cracked slightly. "That was unexpected," he said awkwardly, forcing a laugh. Who would have thought? Some guests laughed politely, but their eyes were still on the young woman. She stood up slowly, unsure what to do. The manager of the hotel came forward and whispered something kind in her ear, telling her to take a bow. She hesitated, then gave a small nod to the crowd. The room burst into cheers again. The businessman tried to recover his charm. "Well," he said loudly, "it seems our staff is more talented than we realized. Maybe she should be performing at our next event." His tone tried to sound playful, but it carried a hint of shame. He could feel the shift in the room. The people who had once laughed at his jokes now admired her instead. As she left the piano, people stopped her to say kind words. A woman in a blue dress told her that the music made her think of her childhood. A young man asked if she had ever played professionally. Someone else asked for her name, saying they wanted to record her next time she performed. She smiled shyly, not knowing what to say. When she returned to the service area, the other staff members looked at her with pride. "That was amazing," one of them whispered. "You showed them." She smiled quietly and picked up her tray again. Her hands were still shaking, not from fear but from the rush of everything that had just happened. She didn't understand how such a simple moment could change so much. For years she had hidden that part of herself, believing it no longer mattered. But tonight proved that talent, once real, never truly disappears. Across the room, the businessman stood near the stage, pretending to enjoy the compliments from guests who praised the evening. But inside he was unsettled. He had been the richest man in the room, the one everyone looked up to. Yet a simple waitress with no wealth or power had just stolen all the attention with nothing but her heart and a few old notes. The rest of the night went on, but it wasn't the same anymore. The air felt lighter, the laughter softer. People kept glancing at the piano as if the memory of her music was still playing. The young woman continued her work quietly, her face calm but her heart full. She had not planned to play. She had not wanted attention. Yet somehow, life had chosen that exact moment to remind her who she truly was. When the event finally ended and the guests began to leave, several of them stopped by the piano again, touching its keys gently as if it still held the echo of her melody. Even the businessman, before walking out, looked at it for a long second, his expression thoughtful. He didn't say anything, but something in his eyes showed regret. As the last lights dimmed and the hall grew quiet, the young woman stood for a moment near the piano before leaving. She placed her hand softly on the keys, smiling faintly. "Thank you," she whispered, as if the piano could hear her. Then she turned and walked out into the night, not knowing that her life had just begun to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, the city woke up as usual, cars honking, shops opening, people rushing to work. But for one person, life had quietly started to change. The young waitress woke up early, as she always did. The tiredness from the long night still clung to her, but she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The sound of the piano, the applause, the faces of the people. It all played again and again in her mind like a dream that felt too real to forget. She made herself a cup of tea in her small kitchen and sat near the window. The morning light spilled over the narrow street outside, and for the first time in a long while she smiled without forcing it. She still couldn't believe that everyone in that grand hall had stood up and clapped for her. It felt like something out of a story, not her real life. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was an old device, slow and scratched, but she used it carefully. She glanced at the screen and saw several messages from her coworkers. "You're all over social media," one message read. "Someone posted your piano video," another said. Her heart skipped. She quickly opened the app, and there it was, the video from last night. Someone had recorded her playing, capturing every note, every moment of silence, and even the stunned look on the guests' faces. The video had already thousands of views with comments pouring in. This is real talent. She played with more emotion than most professionals. Who is she? She stared at the screen, her hands shaking slightly. She had never thought something like this could happen. To her, it was just one song, one moment. But to the people watching, it had meant something much more. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the businessman who had hosted the party was reading the same comments. His name was being mentioned too, but not in the way he liked. Some people were praising the event, but most were criticizing him. So the rich guy tried to humiliate a waitress. Joke's on him. This is what real grace looks like. He should apologize to her publicly. He sat in his office, scrolling through the flood of reactions with growing discomfort. The video had spread across multiple platforms overnight, and the story was being shared everywhere. Waitress forced to play piano shocks elite crowd. Even local news pages had picked it up. For a man used to controlling how people saw him, this was something new. He didn't like being the villain of the story. But for the young woman, life suddenly felt different. When she arrived at work that afternoon, people greeted her with smiles and soft claps. The hotel manager came to her and said, "You've become famous overnight. Guests are calling to ask about you. Some even want to know if you'll play again." She laughed nervously, still not believing it. "I just did what he asked," she said softly. "I didn't mean for it to become such a big thing." The manager nodded kindly. Sometimes the world notices the moments that come from the heart. Throughout the day, she received messages from strangers thanking her for her performance. One message said, "I was having a bad day, but your music made me cry in a good way. Thank you." Another said, "You reminded me why I started playing again." She didn't know how to respond, so she just sent small thank yous. By evening, she was back at the hotel for another shift. The place looked the same. Clean tables, bright lights, expensive perfume in the air. But something felt different. Guests she didn't know smiled when they saw her. Some whispered to each other, recognizing her from the video. She tried to keep her focus on work, but her heart was warm inside. When the businessman arrived that evening for a follow-up meeting with some investors, The atmosphere shifted again. The staff straightened their uniforms and the manager hurried to greet him. He walked through the hall with his usual confident stride, but his eyes kept darting toward the piano. It still stood in the same place, gleaming quietly under the lights. He glanced around and spotted her near the bar counter. Their eyes met for a brief second. She looked down quickly, pretending to fix the trays. He hesitated, then walked over. "I see you've become quite popular," he said, trying to sound casual. His voice carried a hint of forced politeness. She turned slowly and gave a small, respectful nod. "I didn't mean for that to happen, sir." He smiled stiffly. "Well, life's full of surprises, isn't it? You played well last night, very unexpected." She could tell he wasn't used to being in this kind of position, having to acknowledge someone he once tried to mock. His tone was neither harsh nor kind, just uneasy. "Thank you," she said simply. "It was something I hadn't done in a long time." He looked at her for a moment, then said, "Maybe you should play again sometime." The guest seemed to enjoy it. She didn't answer right away. Part of her wanted to say yes. Another part was afraid of being made a spectacle again. She gave a polite smile and said, "Maybe, if it's needed." The businessman nodded and turned away, his expression unreadable. Later that night, as the guests left and the staff cleaned up, she sat alone for a moment near the piano. The hall was quiet now and the lights were dimmed. Her fingers brushed over the keys gently, not pressing them, just feeling the smooth surface. She thought about how strange life could be. One small moment of courage had changed everything. Her co-worker came over and said, "You know, people are still talking about you online. Someone even said a local music school wants to find you." She laughed softly. "Me, I haven't practiced in years. They'll change their minds once they hear that." "Maybe," her co-worker said, "but maybe they won't. Maybe this is your second chance." She didn't reply, but smiled quietly. A second chance. The word stayed with her all night. The next day, she received a call from a community center. The director said they had seen her video and wanted her to come and play for their weekend event. She was surprised and nervous, unsure whether to accept. After some thought, she agreed. "But please," she said shyly, "don't make a big thing of it." When she arrived at the small community hall that weekend, she expected only a few people, but the room was full. Families, children, and elderly people filled the seats. Many recognized her immediately. They clapped warmly when she walked in, not as a celebrity but as someone they genuinely admired. She sat at the piano, her heart racing. It wasn't as grand as the one in the hotel, but it felt comfortable, familiar. When she began to play, the room filled with the same emotion as before, soft, gentle, and honest. She saw people close their eyes and smile. Some held hands. When she finished, the applause was long and heartfelt. A few people came up to her afterward, thanking her for coming. One old man said, "You reminded me of my late wife. She loved the piano. You made me remember her with peace." Those words touched her deeply. She realized then that music had power, not the kind that wins awards or fame, but the kind that reaches hearts quietly and changes something inside them. Far away, in his office, the businessman saw the new videos from her community performance. Reporters were now framing the story differently. They weren't talking about his arrogance anymore. They were talking about her rise from being a waitress to an inspiring musician. His name appeared in the background of the story as the man who accidentally revealed a hidden talent. He leaned back in his chair, sighing. For the first time, he felt small, not because of money or power, but because of the realization that kindness and respect could carry more weight than wealth ever could. Days turned into weeks, and the waitress's life slowly transformed. The hotel allowed her to play during special dinners, and guests often requested her songs. She wasn't paid much extra, but she didn't mind. Every time she touched the piano, she felt her mother's spirit beside her again. She played not for attention, but for peace. The businessman watched her from a distance during these evenings. His expression had changed. It was no longer proud or mocking. It was thoughtful, even a bit humbled. One night after she finished playing, he quietly approached her and said, "You made me realize something. Sometimes we try to measure people by status or appearance, but talent, real talent, has no label. You reminded me of that." She looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his tone. For the first time, he sounded like a human being, not a tycoon. She smiled faintly and said, "Maybe we all just forget that sometimes." He nodded slowly. And for a moment, both stood in silence, the piano still echoing softly behind them. That night, she walked home under the streetlights, her steps light, her heart full. The world hadn't made her rich, but it had given her something far more valuable, a chance to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected for who she truly was. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The following weeks moved faster than she could believe. Each day brought something new. People she didn't know sending kind words, strangers stopping by the hotel just to listen, and journalists asking for interviews she was too shy to give. What had started as a single moment in a grand hall had grown into something much larger. She still worked her regular shifts, carrying trays and greeting guests, but now her presence carried a quiet glow. Some guests recognized her instantly. They whispered, "That's the girl who played at the Tycoon's party," and smiled warmly as she passed. The hotel staff treated her differently too, not out of pity or fame, but with respect. She had shown them that anyone, no matter where they stood, could surprise the world. The hotel manager decided to make something official. One afternoon, he approached her while she was polishing glasses near the counter. "The director wants to speak to you," he said. Her heart skipped. "Did I do something wrong?" He smiled. "Not at all. Quite the opposite." In the manager's office, the hotel director greeted her with a kind expression. "You've brought a lot of attention to our hotel," he said. "People come here asking to hear you play. We'd like to make it part of our weekend evenings. Piano nights with the waitress who stunned the city." She felt embarrassed hearing the title. "I don't think I'm that good, sir. I just play from memory." "That's what people love about it," the director said gently. "You play from the heart. We'll pay you extra and you won't have to do full shifts those nights. You can focus on your music." Her throat tightened. She wasn't used to people offering her opportunities. For years she had worked quietly, unnoticed, doing her best just to survive. And now suddenly her music, something she had once lost, was giving her life new direction. She agreed, trying to hide the tears forming in her eyes. That weekend, the first official piano night took place. The dining hall was filled before the evening even began. The lights were softer, the air calmer. She walked in wearing a simple dress instead of her uniform. People clapped as she approached the piano. Her heart pounded, but she took a deep breath and began to play. The sound spread gently through the hall, wrapping around the people like a memory they didn't know they had. Some closed their eyes, some smiled. The Tycoon was there too, seated at a corner table with a few associates. His usual loudness was gone. He listened quietly, his face thoughtful. After her performance, people lined up to thank her. Some asked if she could teach their children. One woman even handed her a card from a local music academy. "We'd love to offer you a scholarship," the woman said kindly. "Your playing is rare, it's real. It's not about perfection, it's about emotion." She was speechless. All she could do was nod and thank her softly. That night, when she returned home, she placed the card on her small table and stared at it for a long time. The idea of going back to music school felt like a dream. It had once been her mother's biggest wish, and now it was becoming possible again. The next morning, she called the academy. The woman on the other end sounded delighted. "We'll help with everything," she said. "You've already inspired so many. You deserve a chance to grow this gift." When she hung up, she sat in silence, her hands shaking with joy. She thought of her mother and tears filled her eyes. It felt as if life was finally returning something it had once taken away. Meanwhile, the Tycoon story had begun to change in the public's eyes. The media started running pieces about how his event had unexpectedly brought a hidden musician into the spotlight. Some people called him lucky for discovering her, while others reminded everyone how his challenge had come from arrogance. At first, he hated the attention. He didn't like being reminded of his mistake. But as he watched her perform again and again, something inside him began to shift. He saw how people looked at her with admiration, not envy. He noticed how her music softened even the most impatient guests. It was as if she carried a quiet kind of grace that money couldn't buy. One night after her performance ended and the crowd began to leave, he stayed behind. She was helping the staff clear the tables when he approached her. "You've made quite a name for yourself," he said in a low tone. "The whole city's talking about you." She gave a small smile. "I'm just thankful people enjoy the music." He looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "I owe you an apology. That night I was trying to show off. I thought I was being clever. But I realize now I only showed my own ignorance. She was quiet for a moment. His words sounded sincere, something she hadn't expected. We all make mistakes, she said softly. Sometimes good things come out of them too. He nodded slowly. You're kinder than I deserve. For the first time, the pride in his voice was gone. It was replaced with humility. He left the hall soon after, but her words stayed with him for days. As her popularity grew, she received invitations to small events, community gatherings, and even a few charity shows. She accepted the ones that felt right, the ones that were about sharing, not showing off. She often donated part of her small earnings to local music programs for children who couldn't afford lessons. She said it was her way of giving back what life had given her. The tycoon watched all this quietly. He began supporting some of those same community projects, though he never told anyone why. When journalists asked, he simply said, "Everyone deserves a chance to rise." But deep down, he knew who had reminded him of that truth. One evening, the hotel hosted a special anniversary celebration. The director asked her to perform as the main act. This time there would be hundreds of guests, including several well-known musicians. The pressure was high, but she didn't let fear control her. She reminded herself that she wasn't there to impress anyone, just to play. The night arrived, and the hall looked more beautiful than ever. Candles flickered on every table, and the piano gleamed in the center. When she took her seat, the crowd grew silent. The tycoon sat near the front, hands folded, his expression calm but proud. She began to play. The song was one she had written herself, a melody that told her story without a single word. It began with slow, gentle notes that spoke of struggle, then grew brighter like dawn after a long night. The guests sat completely still, listening as if afraid to breathe. When she reached the final note, the room exploded in applause. People rose to their feet, cheering. The tycoon stood as well, clapping the loudest. His eyes shone with something rare, respect. After the performance, a well-known music producer approached her. "Your story is incredible," he said. "I'd like to help you record an album. Not just classical pieces, your own compositions. The world should hear them." She could hardly find words. She had never imagined anything like that. The producer smiled. "Think about it, no rush. But remember, not many people get this chance." That night she walked home under the stars, her heart filled with both joy and disbelief. She thought about how everything had started, with one cruel challenge meant to humiliate her. Yet from that moment her life had blossomed in a way she could never have planned. The next day she met the tycoon again. This time he was not the proud man who had once mocked her. He spoke gently, almost like an old friend. "If you ever need support for your music," he said, "I'd like to help. Not for reputation, just because you deserve it." She looked at him quietly for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "But I think what I needed most I already have." He smiled slightly. "And what's that?" "Belief," she replied. "I found it again that night." He nodded slowly, understanding what she meant. For the first time in his life, he felt proud of someone else more than himself. In the months that followed, her album began taking shape. The songs carried pieces of her journey, the pain, the courage, and the quiet power of forgiveness. Each melody spoke to those who listened, reminding them that even in the darkest moments, something beautiful can grow. And as her music spread far beyond the city, the memory of that night in the ballroom never faded. It became a story people told often, not about wealth or power, but about how one person's grace turned humiliation into hope. The studio lights were soft and warm, very different from the ones at the hotel. She sat on the piano bench, her fingers lightly touching the keys, feeling both nervous and excited. The sound engineer adjusted the microphone above the piano and gave her a thumbs up through the glass window. "This is your moment," the producer said kindly. "Just play like you always do, like the world doesn't exist." She nodded, took a slow breath, and began to play. The notes filled the room with a quiet power, echoing softly against the walls. She wasn't thinking about the cameras or the recording equipment. She was thinking about her mother, about the years she had worked in silence, and about that night when a cruel dare had brought her back to life. By the time she played the last note, her eyes were wet. The engineer didn't say anything for a few seconds, just pressed a button to stop recording and looked at her through the glass. Then he spoke into the mic. "That was beautiful. The producer smiled. That's your first track done. Over the next few weeks, she recorded more pieces. Some old tunes she remembered from her childhood, others completely new. Each song carried a feeling, a story. Sometimes joy, sometimes loss, but always hope. The producer kept telling her, "Your music feels honest." That's rare. When the album was finally released, no one expected what happened next. Within days, it spread across the internet. People shared her music on social media, calling it the sound of healing. One comment said, "I played this when I felt lost, and somehow I cried and smiled at the same time." Radio stations started featuring her songs, and news outlets told her story again, the waitress who became a musician after being challenged at a billionaire's party. But this time the story wasn't about humiliation or surprise. It was about courage, kindness, and second chances. Meanwhile, the tycoon watched everything quietly. He saw the interviews, the music videos, and the growing admiration people had for her. Something in him felt proud, though it was mixed with guilt. He still remembered the look on her face that night when he had called her out in front of everyone. It had been meant as a joke, a way to amuse the guests. But now he realized how small it had made him look. One evening, he called his assistant and said, "Find out when her next performance is. I'd like to attend." A week later, he walked into a small concert hall where she was playing for a local charity. The room wasn't filled with rich people or cameras, just ordinary families, children and a few older folks sitting quietly, waiting for the music to begin. When she came out, dressed simply as always, the crowd clapped warmly. She smiled shyly, then began her set. The sound of the piano wrapped the room in peace. Even the children sat still. The tycoon sat in the back row, his eyes on her hands, watching how they moved so gently yet spoke so loudly. Halfway through the concert, he found himself closing his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about business, money, or power. He was just listening. When the final note faded, he felt something inside him shift again, like a locked door opening slowly. After the show, he waited until most of the people had left before approaching her. She looked surprised to see him there. "I didn't expect you tonight," she said softly. "I wanted to hear it for myself," he replied. "You've come a long way," she smiled politely. "It's been quite a journey." He hesitated before speaking again. "I've been thinking a lot lately about how things started. I know I've said sorry before, but it never felt enough. That night, I was trying to make myself look powerful. But in truth, you were the only one who showed real strength." She looked down for a moment, then met his eyes. "I forgave you long ago," she said. If that night hadn't happened, maybe none of this would have either. Sometimes life has strange ways of leading us where we're meant to go. Her calmness disarmed him. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "I wish I had even half your grace," she smiled gently. "We all learn in our own time." He nodded slowly. "If you ever need support for your foundation or for your music school, please let me know. I don't want recognition. I just want to help." She thanked him sincerely, but there was no trace of pride in her voice, only gratitude. In the months that followed, her album reached places she never imagined. A well-known filmmaker used one of her songs in a movie about human kindness. The track went viral again and messages poured in from people all around the world. Some said her music helped them through depression. Others said it gave them the courage to start again. Her simple melodies had become a bridge connecting strangers. She started a small foundation with the help of the producer, a program to teach music to underprivileged children. She didn't call it a charity. She called it a circle of hope. Every weekend, she taught classes in a bright little studio filled with second-hand instruments. The laughter of children filled the air, mixing with the sound of piano keys and the soft rhythm of drums. The tycoon visited once, quietly, standing near the doorway as she guided a group of young students through a song. The children's faces lit up when they finally got the notes right. He watched her smile proudly, and for the first time, he understood what true success looked like. It wasn't measured in wealth, but in how many lives you could touch. Later, as he walked back to his car, he told his driver, "You know, I've attended hundreds of grand events, but this was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Back at the studio, she continued composing. Some nights she stayed late, lost in the flow of the keys, unaware of time passing. Her second album was inspired by her students. each song carrying the spirit of their laughter and innocence. When the album launched, it reached even more hearts than before. One of the tracks became a symbol of peace, used in humanitarian campaigns around the world. She began receiving invitations to perform internationally, but she always made sure to return home to her small studio. That was where her heart truly belonged. One evening, the Tycoon called her. His voice sounded weaker than usual. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "You've given me something I can't explain. Watching what you've built, it's changed me. I've started funding music programs in schools. You showed me what generosity really means." She felt a wave of emotion but kept her voice calm. "I'm glad you found something meaningful," she said. "We're all just trying to make this world a little better." He laughed softly. "And you've done that more than anyone I know." After that call, she often thought about how people could change. The man who once mocked her in public had become one of her quiet supporters. It reminded her that sometimes people don't need punishment, they need understanding. Years later, when her foundation had expanded across several cities, she gave a speech at a cultural event. The hall was full of teachers, artists, and children. She stood on stage, humble as ever, and said, "Music saved me when I thought my life had no direction. It reminded me that kindness can start anywhere, even from pain. If my story teaches anything, I hope it's this: never underestimate what someone carries inside." The audience stood and applauded. Among them was the Tycoon, now older, smiling proudly. He didn't go on stage or seek attention. He just watched quietly, knowing that her light was enough for both of them. After the event, she found him outside. He was sitting on a bench looking up at the sky. "Beautiful speech," he said softly. "You've built something that will outlive us both." She sat beside him. "We all build something even when we don't realize it." He nodded. "You built hope." She looked at him with a warm smile. "Maybe we both did." The city lights glowed behind them, and for a long moment neither spoke. The world felt still, peaceful. The same stars that had watched her through years of struggle now shone over her success. And somewhere deep inside, she knew her mother would be proud. The years passed gently, like pages of a calm story turning on their own. Her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined that night in the ballroom. What once began as a moment of embarrassment had turned into a journey filled with purpose and love. Her name had become known around the world, yet she never let fame change her. She still lived simply, still played the same piano that had started it all, and still believed that music was meant to touch hearts, not just earn applause. Her foundation had grown beyond her small studio. There were now centers in several towns where children could come, learn, and express themselves freely. Many of her students were from difficult backgrounds. Some had lost parents, some came from poor families. But when they touched an instrument, their eyes lit up just as hers once had. She would walk into the rooms and see children laughing, learning, playing together, and it filled her with quiet pride. Every note they played reminded her that beauty could rise even from the hardest places. The Tycoon had also changed over the years. His name no longer appeared in the gossip pages as the man who owned half the city. Instead, he was now known for his silent contributions. He had donated large amounts to educational projects and music schools, but always requested that his name remain hidden. People often spoke of an unknown benefactor who believed in helping others without reward. He and the pianist stayed in touch, not as business partners or social acquaintances, but as two people who had learned something deep about life from one another. Sometimes they met for coffee after her concerts, sitting at a small cafe by the riverside. Their conversations were never about wealth or fame. They talked about dreams, about how people change, and about how a single act of kindness can echo far beyond what anyone expects. One autumn evening, after one of her smaller charity performances, he joined her outside as she packed her music sheets into her bag. The evening air was cool and the orange glow of streetlights reflected off the river nearby. "You've made the city a better place," he said quietly. She smiled. "It's not just me. So many people helped make it happen. Even you," he shook his head lightly. "No, you did something I couldn't. Turn pain into something beautiful. I spent years collecting things that never made me happy. But watching what you built, it gave me peace I didn't even know I needed." She looked at him with gentle eyes. "Sometimes life teaches us in strange ways. You taught me something too." He raised an eyebrow. "What could I have possibly taught you?" "That people can change," she said softly. and that forgiveness can heal more than anger ever could. He didn't reply, but the small smile on his face said everything. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft sound of the river. As the months went on, her foundation received international recognition. She was invited to speak at conferences about the power of music in healing. Everywhere she went, people asked her to play that same piece, the one she had played in the ballroom years ago, the one that had changed her life. Every time she played it, she felt the same emotion, as if that frightened young waitress was still there sitting beside her, reminding her never to forget where she came from. One winter, she received a letter. The handwriting was neat but shaky. It was from the Tycoon. The letter said, "I've grown older and my health is fading, but I find comfort in knowing the world has someone like you in it. I don't fear the end anymore because I've seen what kindness can create. If there's one thing I regret, it's that I didn't understand sooner that wealth means nothing if it doesn't lift others. Thank you for teaching me that lesson without ever saying it out loud." She read the letter several times, her heart heavy yet full of warmth. She wrote back, thanking him for his friendship, for his help with the children, and for showing that true change comes from the heart. A few months later, she received the news that he had passed away quietly in his sleep. There was no public funeral, no press coverage, but his will revealed that he had left a large part of his fortune to her foundation. When she found out, she sat by her piano, her eyes full of tears. Not tears of sadness, but of gratitude, for how life had connected two very different souls in such an unexpected way. She decided to honor him in the only way she knew how. That summer, the foundation organized a grand concert, not for celebrities or sponsors, but for the community. The stage was set in a park surrounded by flowers and soft lights. Thousands came, from children to elderly couples from all walks of life. At the front of the stage stood a small frame with his photograph, smiling gently as if watching over everyone. When she walked onto the stage, the crowd grew quiet. She sat at the piano and looked at the stars above. The evening air was warm and still. "This song," she said softly into the microphone, "is for someone who once challenged me, not knowing he was actually setting me free." Then she began to play. The music started low and slow, like a memory being told in whispers. Then it rose, bright and full of life, each note flowing like water. The melody carried both sadness and hope, pain and peace. People in the audience closed their eyes. Some smiled, some cried. Children swayed to the rhythm, unaware that they were part of something much bigger than a concert. When the final note faded into the air, there was silence for a long moment, then applause that felt endless. But she didn't look up. She sat there quietly, her hand resting on the keys, her heart full of emotions too deep for words. That night became one of the most talked about moments in the city's history, not because of fame or grandeur, but because of the raw humanity it carried. The story of the waitress and the tycoon became something people told their children, not as a tale of wealth or talent, but as proof that forgiveness can change lives and kindness can turn strangers into family. Years passed, and her name continued to inspire. The children she had taught grew up and became teachers, musicians, and community workers. Some of them started their own music centers in other countries. Her work had become a movement, one built on compassion, not pride. She continued to perform occasionally, though her main focus remained the children. One afternoon, she sat in the same small studio where it had all begun. Sunlight streamed through the windows, landing on the piano keys. She played softly to herself, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the room. A young student entered quietly and listened for a while before saying, "Miss, why do you always smile when you play that song?" She looked at the child with a gentle expression. "Because it reminds me that sometimes the hardest moments in life lead us to the most beautiful ones." The child nodded, not fully understanding but feeling the warmth in her words. As the day faded into evening, she continued playing, her heart peaceful. Outside, the city hummed softly with life, the same city that had once watched her rise from a quiet waitress to a symbol of hope. She didn't play for fame anymore. She played for memories, for forgiveness, for love. And somewhere in the quiet echo of her music, it felt as if the tycoon's laughter still lingered. Not the loud, mocking one from years ago, but a gentle, content sound, proud of the woman she had become. Her fingers glided over the final note, letting it linger in the air until it faded completely. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and whispered to herself, Thank you for everything. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of the piano down the streets, past the park, over the river, like a story being told one last time. And though the night settled around the city, her melody continued to live on, in every heart that had ever heard it, in every child who now believed that dreams, no matter how broken, could always be rebuilt. The world eventually forgot the details of how it all began, but it never forgot the feeling her music gave them: hope. And in the quiet of her simple home, she smiled, knowing that was all she had ever wanted to give.